All right, good morning. Ana Gutiérrez with Womble, Dickinson, and I'm going to chat with you about the mandatory GHG reduction requirements required for the midstream sector, fuel combustion equipment, and that rulemaking is December 2024. So here's our agenda. As you know, Kirby runs a tight ship, so we're going to stick to the agenda pretty tight, and we got 19 minutes to do it. Let's start with the statewide targets just to set context as to why we're talking about these reductions for the midstream segment. So in 2021, House Bill 21-1266 was passed, and we had targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and this is statewide, not just midstream, by 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050. This little graph you see on the screen sort of combines the next iteration, which was Senate Bill 2316, changing those goals, adding a 60% reduction. I think I'm in and out here. 65% reduction by 2035, and then 90% reduction by 2045. That 90% by 2050 is up to 100%. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Feels like it's dabbling in my ear. Just let me know. So, drives the policy directives that we're seeing on the ground is the Colorado GHG roadmap and how they evaluated and analyzed sectors and segments of different industries. So this pie graph, the Colorado Energy Office did a deep dive on emissions inventories and calculations with respect to a variety of different industries, not just oil and gas. You see transportation on there. We have oil and gas. We have buildings. Utilities are on there. And there's a segment it's a very hard color to describe, burnt yellow on that lower left corner. That's the industrial energy sector, and we refer to it as industrial and manufacturing. And the midstream oil and gas fuel combustion equipment emissions inventory is in that. So we're not in the oil and gas sector that's strictly dedicated to oil and gas, and that matters with respect to what our reduction targets are. And then this is also the Colorado Energy Office, the GHG, this is 1.0 to 2.0. And what this does is it takes 1266 and it takes those targets that we originally had, and it sets out policy directives of where the state wants to focus GHG reduction measures. So you'll see the big chunks, the blue at the top is utilities, and then the next biggest chunk are oil and gas measures, again in burnt brown, if you will, of that color. And those are really the two major focuses for these reductions, although you've probably heard of the various reduction measures for manufacturing, which was GEM 1, and then GEM 2, which were recently finalized. So with that backdrop, what's our requirements for our midstream sector? The requirement is to reduce by 20% below 2015 levels by 2030. A lot of numbers. But to be really clear, this applies to fuel combustion equipment only at midstream operations. So it's not going to capture fugitives, for example. Think engines, turbines, heaters, reboilers, and boilers. To facilitate the statewide targets collectively. This diagram, we can flip through this one pretty quickly because we'll talk more about it here in a minute. This is from the draft midstream segment ERP. We'll talk about what that document is. It's not yet been published. It should come out in the next few weeks, but the data have been circulated to the Midstream Steering Committee and are accessible very soon. This just shows location of that fuel combustion equipment. So these are the areas of the state where we're seeing the greenhouse gas emissions. You'll obviously see a good chunk in western Colorado and then a density there in the DJ Basin. So what does this mean on the ground? Here's the data. So the 2015 baseline for midstream fuel combustion equipment is 4.9, I'm just going to, for easy numbers, 4.9 million metric tons of CO2e. Our 2030 target is 3.9, and in 2021, which is the most complete data set we currently have, we're at 4.57 million metric tons. So we're about 8% on our way to the 20% reduction for midstream fuel combustion. The delta is that 0.6, that 0.63. So that's really what we're working towards between status quo now or as of 2021, and the 2030 target. There are approximately 274 affected facilities, so it's those facilities that will share the burden of finding the reductions to hit this statewide target. One caveat is, again, we're looking at 2021 data as it's the most complete data set for this inventory, and we could obviously see some shifts across industry with respect to what that data looks like at present. So, that was just one bubble to tell you that. So back into that sort of burnt yellow color, that 4.9 million metric tons, it's about 26% of the manufacturing and industrial sector. So that's the attribution to midstream fuel combustion equipment in the baseline inventory. All right, so Midstream Steering Committee. Can't talk about the steering committee without talking about the 2020 engine rulemaking that was before the Air Quality Control Commission. So back in 2020, there was a rulemaking to reduce NOx emissions from larger engines. And there was a lot of discussion around sort of fleet-wide, statewide, massive electrification of these different systems. And there were a lot of limitations from both regulators, industry, stakeholders, participants, because we lacked knowledge, right? We weren't sure how could we do this? What did the data look like? What are we actually regulating? And so that together with 1266 was really the impetus for our 2021 rulemaking, which was effectively a process rulemaking. We set forth the Midstream Steering Committee. It's in part Regulation 7 of the, again, Air Quality Control Commission regulations. And it was a technical working group of 16 sort of diverse volunteer members representing various stakeholders and folks from industry, Colorado Energy Office, Air Division, and the purpose was really to collect data, analyze it, and figure out, can we give a recommendation to the division on how they would, regulate this particular sector of industry. And the real crux of it is the interplay between, reducing, you could have on-site reductions, and we'll talk about that in a minute, of, just modifications or retrofits to an engine. But then there's electrification, which pulls into the utilities universe, right? So we have to have coordination, and doing this statewide is a significant undertaking. Oh, we're not moving on here. There we go. Okay, so this is just your list of the Midstream Steering Committee members. There are a lot of our friends here in the audience that participated, and you should thank them for their time when you see them, because they spent a lot of it. There were some 35 official sort of formal meetings and over 80 subcommittee meetings over the past 18 months to talk about all these issues midstream. So if you see any of these members, say thank you. This is really just the Midstream Steering Committee process. So we created this committee in February 2022. That was the rule adopted by the Air Commission. We sent out a data collection request to operators in April 2022 to just get a general sense of what's out there, what are we dealing with, and then operator responses were due July 2022, so it was a really pretty quick turnaround. And then in March of 23, the Midstream Steering Committee put together what we call the Company Emission Reduction Plan, CERP, guidance document, and that was to inform how each individual company would submit specific data with respect to their midstream fuel combustion equipment to the committee, so that that data was homogeneous, if you will, to be able to put it into one spreadsheet, one inventory, and have an analysis of it. Those CERPs were due in September 2023, and then a bunch of work began for the committee to analyze that data, which leads us to the culmination eventually, which is a December 2024 rulemaking. So right now, we're really in the process. The division is going to publish the segment ERP, which I'll talk about that in just a minute, in the next couple of weeks. There is a 30-day comment period if folks are interested in commenting on that. And then that will inform ongoing discussions for a draft rule that we should work on this summer, noticed in September, and a December 2024 rulemaking. So I want to touch on the CERP guidance document, partly because how we asked operators to provide information is informing sort of the data set we have and what we can do with that data set. And it was really a deep dive. Again, sort of the impetus of why we did this was to be informed as we walk into a regulatory landscape for this rulemaking. So that guidance document was finalized in March 2023, and it was an intensive data gathering process. So every operator had to do an inventory of all their midstream fuel combustion equipment, both location, AIRS ID, facility name, longitude, whether you're in or outside of a DI community, GHG emissions calculation associated with every single piece of equipment, reduction options across your fleet. So where were your preferred options? What was that going to cost? What was the cost per ton? And then what was going to be the demand on the electric grid for the various proposals. So it was a very, very intensive data collection. I think what's really unique about this is it directed operators to develop emission reduction options list, but you did this based on a variety of scenarios. And this is, I think, a little unique to what we've seen in past rulemakings, if you will, where we are really projecting into the future. So it had each operator look at growth scenarios, shrink scenarios, and flat scenarios. And we leveled it out so everybody was looking at the same percentage of growth, shrink, flat. The purpose of that is so nobody's disclosing what do they think their plans are for the next 10 years, right? That's CBI, and we don't want that out there. So we really normalized the data set, but we did want to have the opportunity to look at what are we actually dealing with by 2030. So this gave us a really comprehensive data set to evaluate. And then based on those various scenarios, the operators had to develop an emission reduction target list. And that list had to prioritize reductions with co-benefits in DIC. So we have those lists submitted by each of the operators. This just shows the reduction options that are on the table. Obviously, there could be more that's on the table, which is that gray other actions. But the primary ones that came to light through the Midstream Steering Committee and other data collection was equipment replacement, right, upgrade to newer equipment, retrofitting for efficiencies and improvement, operational adjustments or tuning, retirement or shutdown is an option, and then of course engine and turbine electrification. And then electrification was evaluated more broadly, just side note, for boilers and reboilers, which you saw on the list. But generally speaking, there's just not, for the size of these units, there's not opportunity for electrification like there might be for engines. So all of those company ERPs, CERPs, were submitted to inform a segment-wide EER, segment and emission reduction plans, SERP, sorry, too many acronyms here, to really provide a recommendation to the division to say, hey, here's the data, here's the results of the data, and here's how we might be thinking about walking into the rulemaking. I think a few takeaways is this exercise, this data collection exercise was really successful. There were 42 CERPs submitted, and only three operators did not submit CERP, and they accounted for 0.22% of the CO2e in the state. So the data point there is the data is largely complete. For high-level data points, the 5 highest emitting companies account for 79.5% of CO2e reported. Engines across the state account for 62.6% of CO2e reported. And then the 3 highest emitting counties are 86.8% of total CO2e, those counties being Weld, Garfield, and Rio Blanco. And then I think a couple of the other valuable results from that data collection was that we saw that there are varying calculation methods. How do we synergize that, make sure the data we're getting is all the same input-output exercise so that we can compare apples to apples. I think it was really a useful exercise to identify the good work that's already been done where folks have found opportunities through business as usual to electrify engines, for example, and then really just an understanding of what are these pieces of equipment and where are they in the state. So what the SERP, and again, this will be published in the next few weeks, and you'll see this data set both in a spreadsheet and then in a Word document. And if you really want to geek out, you can dive into the spreadsheets. They're pretty dense. But again, with the level of data that we were able to collect, the SERP was, it took those data sets, it took the preferred options at the various scenarios, the growth, shrink, and the flat, and then it was able to assign a cap by 2030 to each of the individual companies, and think parent company when I say that, so subs roll up to parent, and sort of model out how we would assign out based on throughput, essentially the allocation of emissions to each of these companies to get to the 20% reduction by 2030 across the segment. So it was ultimately a really useful exercise, and this data set's, I think, going to be exceptionally helpful as we walk into the 2024 December rulemaking. These are just a couple of other data points that you'll see in the segment ERP that are, I think, really important to the analysis. Again, I can't emphasize how much the focus was on data collection with this, which is just going to assist us in an informed rulemaking process. But as most folks know, 1266 does require we prioritize reductions in disproportionately impacted communities, looking both GHGs and then focusing on the co-pollutant reductions from your criteria pollutants and HAPs as well. So that was a data point that was also required to be calculated, submitted by each of these operators, so we could have a look-see at our various scenarios. Where are we going to find these reductions in DIC, and what are they going to look like? So statewide, the flat scenario projected 57.8% reductions in DIC, and then growth increased to 70.1% in DIC, and then that chart shows the measured reductions of the what are defined by the state as harmful air pollutants, but criteria pollutants and HAPs. Another important data point that was collected was costs, right? This rule, when it drops, is not going to come without really, really significant costs. And I have to emphasize that because this is probably some of the most costly reduction measures that will be implemented in the state of Colorado. You'll see these are just the ranges that were submitted by operators. So an individual project concept at one facility could be extremely cost effective. At another facility, they could cost out, right? And statute and good policy really reasonably bound us by both cost and technical feasibility. So this is going to continue to be a point in conversation of, where are we going to get the reductions and at what cost, and what are the limitations ultimately adopted in any rule. This data point is having a look at the demand on the grid, right? What are we going to ask of our utilities resulting from the electrification of the midstream fuel combustion equipment? And so for each of these scenarios, we asked folks to let us know what is the expected demand going to be on the grid and on what anticipated timeline. I think this one is also, while we have a bunch of data on this particular point, this is going to be a continued conversation to understand how can we sequence this extremely, extremely aggressive demand on the grid on a really short timeline. 2030 is, just a few years away, and do that in a way that maintains grid stability and hits the required timelines. So this one is probably going to be one of the more continued challenging conversations in advancing the GHG reduction targets for this sector. So bringing it all full circle with the starting point, and to be very clear, the segment is capped in 2030. There's a cap at 2030, and the recommendation from the Midstream Steering Committee is then to give a cap for each company by 2030. So rather than look at sort of the delta reduction that needs to be made, because that reduction could differ depending on if someone goes up or down in their emissions since their baseline, we're just looking at a cap at 2030. The real crux is, how is that cap allocated, essentially an emissions budget to each operator. And the Midstream Steering Committee has put some long and hard thought into how we do that. I think the starting point is to look at the company-wide basis, right? So folks can roll up their fleet on a company-wide basis and find the most effective and cost-effective emission reduction opportunities. and then looking at equitable allocation through a variety of factors, the primary one being throughput. So essentially, the more throughput you have, you'd be in the higher bucket of your allocations. And if you're looking at throughput and then everybody has to hit a cap, this is, to be very clear, this is not an intensity rulemaking, but by virtue of that mechanism alone, it sort of demands folks to hit a competitive intensity to reduce emissions across the board. Obviously, one of the recommendations from the committee is to prioritize reductions co-benefiting DI communities, and then consider, I think one thing we have to monitor is sort of the shift in the definition of DIC or conversations around CIC, so that's something that we're continuing to monitor, stay on top of, and figure out how we proactively, and sometimes we just have to react because definitions change so quickly. I think one of the key elements that has come out of this is making sure we have consistent data collection and analysis, right? We have to be comparing apples to apples and not apples to potatoes, right? It's just really challenging to look at data and compare and make demands on any operator without having equal data. The committee talked a lot about, and I'll wind up here pretty quick to get to, oh, okay. Corey was giving me the hook already. He's very strict. He said 19 minutes. Anyways, you guys can keep me honest, or just tell me to stop talking. So there was a lot of focus on making sure this is a rulemaking and a rule that creates space for smaller operators, right? So there were, some of the larger operators were on the Midstream Steering Committee, and I think you saw a lot of commentary from them recognizing that there would probably be a lot of weight that would need to be carried by those larger operators to make sure we can make continued room for the smaller operators in the state of Colorado to thrive. I think that's something that's really front of mind for this committee and for other folks as well. One thing that came out of this, I'm just going to go back to the cost slide, is it was really clear and really stark. The data showed that there are cost-effective projects, and then there are just not cost-effective projects or projects that are infeasible. So in Western Colorado and in rural Western Colorado in particular, it's much more challenging, if not infeasible, to electrify or tie into the grid at some of these facilities. And so that is going to be an issue of what do we ask of those operators. So around that conversation, there's a discussion around a GHG credit trading system, right? Because we expect that there will be some operators that will overperform on their targets. We expect that there will be some operators that underperform on their targets, whether that's a cost issue and feasibility issue or otherwise. And so that trading market would level out the playing field so folks could achieve compliance and find a flexible pathway to compliance. This is a recommendation from the committee. I wouldn't call it a global recommendation from the committee. I think there are a lot of varying perspectives on this issue, but it is certainly an issue, topic of discussion. The compliance deadline is December 2029, essentially to hit the 2030 deadline. We'll be reporting in arrears, so I don't think we'll see the data collection until 2030. There is no, and I think this is an important point, there's no interim prescribed interim reductions. So in a few of the other industry reduction rulemakings you've seen before the Air Quality Control Commission, there's interim reductions, which is intended to ratchet down before you ratchet down to the target. Because Midstream is really aiming for these massive projects that are system-wide, that takes a lot of time. So there was a lot of conversation about, hey, we need to give folks runway to be able to get there to make sure we have compliance and not, essentially to set folks up for success. So there's a recommendation for no interim reductions. And then, of course, annual reports by parent company for full transparency. And all of the data that I talked about, the segment ERP will be posted soon, but all of the guidance document, all the CERPs, those are all publicly posted on CDPHE's website, so you can see those data and have access to all that information. So the big takeaway, if you take nothing away, take this away. There is a December 2024 rulemaking. It will be noticed in September. If you are a midstream operator, if you are a local community with midstream operations in your county, municipality, this is something to pay attention to. It's going to be a really big impact, I think, on midstream operations in a way we haven't seen before. And I think it's going to be precedent setting. I would expect there will be numerous other states, jurisdictions that will have a look at what Colorado's doing, which is not unheard of, and perhaps follow suit. And then this is just your Womble, Bond, Dickinson, Denver team. You have Scott Anderson over there who's joined me. Find your way over there to chat with him. And then folks who weren't able to make it, Wayne Chancellor, Michael, and Noah. And with that, I will open up to questions.
A few minutes for Q&A. Y'all raise your hand so our folks can get to you with the microphone for the questions for Anna. And do it in advance so we can plan to get over to you right over there. Thank you.
Steve Soychek, Colorado Mesa University. So when you look at electrifying something, you know, the electricity obviously is a secondary source, and it's being generated by coal and natural gas with a lot of wind now. But that wind sometimes is backed up with a lot of natural gas that's run inefficiently, you know, as opposed to a combined cycle. So do you take into account the emissions of electrification that we have and offset, and does it truly offset it by getting rid of a natural gas engine? Yeah,
so I will report out on what the segment ERP or the CERP asked, and then I will give you sort of Anna's opinion on that topic. So the first bit is when folks were asked, what's the grid demand going to be? They were also asked, what is the GHG increase going to be as a result of that grid demand? Right, so the process is contemplating that we're not going to net out to zero just because we go to the grid, because that is, in most cases, fuel-fired coal, and then I think there's a lot of focus to shift to more renewable energies. I think, again, now this, you're getting into Anna's opinion. The challenge we have is the way that this has been set up as a policy in the state of Colorado is we are segmented industry by industry, and then sometimes within industry by within industry. And in that way, it makes it really challenging to look at the net economy-wide, statewide, region-wide reductions when all we're allowed to look at is what reduction are we getting with this fuel combustion equipment, not necessarily taking into perspective if we're pushing that, you know, somewhere else. So I think it is. I think it's a conversation coming, and it's probably coming really quickly on these more aggressive targets towards 90% and 100% GHG reduction. We're going to have to look at this at a statewide and regional, if not national scale.
With that, I believe we're out of time for questions. Apologize for that. And Anna will be around all the 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.